Trevor, before we hear from Zia Youssef, reforms certainly have momentum now, don't they?
They absolutely do. And in fact, we spent quite a lot of time with a rather distinguished panel, Ian Martin, and columnist Tim Montgomery, Tom Baldwin, the biographer of Keir Starmer, and Rachel Johnson, talking about whether this is just a flash in the pan or whether this is going to be something permanent. I think the consensus is that, number one, we don't know, and we can't know. But I think people are leaning towards the idea that maybe it's a big thing, but not that big, and that normal service will probably be resumed. I am not so sure. I think something underlying this has changed politics.
Well, let's talk about that in a second. Here is Zia Youssef talking about this plan they have to remoralise young people.
What we need to do is stop demoralising our young people. So what we're talking about is stop teaching young people in schools writ large that they should hate their country, that they should be ashamed. And look at the character...
Do you genuinely believe that teachers are going about telling children to hate their country?
Look at the character assassination that has taken place on the great Sir Winston Churchill. Look at it, and go and look at the views of young people that have been polled around Sir Winston Churchill. It is a travesty. How many of our young people know who Isambard Kingdom Brunel is, and know all of the incredible things that Britain has given the world? Look, we make no apology for this. Young people should be taught history accurately.
Racking my brains right now, Trevor, to think about what I know of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, other than railways and big in Bristol. But back to the thinking around this. Look, Reform won 677 council seats from a start of 0, almost exactly the same as how many the Tories lost. There's a reason they're saying this now, because they believe they've got young people in particular to talk to as a result.
Yes. It's worth saying, by the way, that Reform has done pretty well using social media. Nigel Farage is immensely popular on TikTok. They've used it very creatively. So the sort of image that Farage has of, a sort of slightly only fools and horses bloke down the pub is belied by the machinery that they've created, and the Zia Youssef, who I interviewed there, is credited with modernising their machine and making them more popular. But I think that there's an interesting question here about what they really want to do. Zia Youssef makes this point, which I think has some resonance in the country, that some of the things that people in Middle England feel this country stands for are being forgotten. And that's particularly poignant, I think, in the week where we are marking VE Day. But I think that they still have a bit of work to do to convince everybody that there's a sort of wholesale abandonment of the past in our schools, for example. And if they don't do that, then the question arises, number one, I thought that Nigel Farage was against the nanny state. And number two, as I put to Zia Youssef, they scored a big success this week in a by-election caused by a member of parliament who punched a man in the street. And their big mayoral victory was by Andrea Jenkins, who became famous for giving the finger to protesters outside Downing Street. Now, are politicians the right people to be giving moral guidance?
Although I think you're right when it comes to history. If any young people under the age of 40 know what Only Fools and Horses is, it would be a surprise. But we'd be plonkers to not show them how great it was.
Classy, Matt, classy.
Come on.
And by the way, you obviously know more than most people about Isambard Kingdom Brunel. I know quite a lot because I was an engineer. But,
there you go. There you go. Just drop that in.
Your knowledge is very impressive.
That's the only two facts I've got about him. Back to the serious business of politics. Sophie Ridge was leading the coverage of the local elections for us in England earlier in the week, and I think Sophie nailed it when she said now Reform will have experience in government to point to. It's not just them talking themselves up, it will be pointing to what they do in local government that will be important for them next.
I think that is right, and as ever, the political team here at Sky is, to be honest, slightly ahead of the pack, because I think other people are making the point that, oh, they're inexperienced, they won't know what to do. But actually, I think number one, having been a person elected to local government myself in the past, I think, to be honest, experience of being there is slightly overrated. I've seen people who've been local councillors for 30 years, and to be honest, I don't think that they're that impressive. And so people have come along and made a big change. But I think Sophie's point is correct, that actually this is a platform for them. And that's one of the reasons I think that maybe something here has changed, including, by the way, you're right, it will give them the experience, but it will also give the electorate the experience of voting for reform not being a wasted vote. And that changes things quite dramatically.
When it comes to the big losers on the night, well, of course, Labour were losers. You mentioned the by-election they lost there, although that was on a pretty low turnout. It has to be said, lower than 30% turnout there. So things always seem to be different in by-elections compared to general elections. But the Conservatives, as I said, losing, I think, 674 council seats, losing overall control of a lot of them as well. And their the Tory co-chair, Nigel Huddleston, spoke to you earlier on. Here's what he had to say.
Nigel Farage is a force in British politics. He is an incredibly good politician in many ways, but people do know him and he's a known quantity. But the one thing about Nigel Farage is, and we're seeing this again and again and again, he is a populist. He is increasingly saying everything that anybody wants to hear. He's trying to be all things to all men. We are re-establishing ourselves as a credible alternative government based on sound Conservative principles and values. And our values and our principles, and therefore our policies, will define the future of our party.
That's one perspective in the Conservative Party, Trevor. The other that we hear the likes of Robert Jenrick are saying is they need to get real and perhaps have a conversation with Reform. That's of course, if Reform even want to listen to that.
Well, there's a lot of talk about the Conservatives and what their relationship with the Reform might be. Will they do deals? Will they cooperate locally and so on? I think the bigger worry that they should have is something much more subtle and less headline-making than that, which is just simply a drift. Our team here did some research. There are 18 people that we regard as key figures in Reform's leadership. They're MPs, people who will now be council leaders, people like Zia Youssef, who is the party chair. And of those 18, 11 of them are former Conservatives.
Yeah.
And I think the real worry that the Conservatives should have is that just little bit by little bit, people start to see what they regard as the writing on the wall, and they quietly slip away from being members of the Conservative Party or representing the Conservative Party and defect to Reform. And that suddenly, over the time, over the next year, when we come to the next local elections, that Nigel Huddleston, who has to create, a machine to win those local elections, will find that he has no crew on his ship because they've all crossed to Reform. I think that is the real thing that they need to be worried about.
Yes, and there are still those rumblings about whether Boris Johnson is the answer and is he going to make a comeback. And I don't want to talk about that because that's...
Well, I will just tell you that literally, as we were coming off air, Rachel Johnson said that Boris had called her during the programme and she wished she had taken the call because when he does that, it means he has something to say. I'm so annoyed.
Well, look, I'm sure he's still watching now, so Boris, give us a bell if you like. We're happy to chat to you about whether you're going to make a comeback. Other parties did do well as well, of course. I mean, and we're not glossing over the fact that Labour had a bad night, but I think it's more important to talk about the successes of the Greens and the Lib Dems. Labour 10 months in, they're expecting some sort of a backlash just by virtue of being the incumbent. Of course, I think that loss in the by-election is a big one. I think losing Doncaster Council, another big loss for Labour as well, given that I don't think it's ever been anything other than a Labour council. But back to the successes, the Greens did well, of course, and the Lib Dems too. They have momentum, maybe not the size of Reform, but they certainly have momentum too, and Ed Davey talked to you about that.
I think there will be a lot of people waking up and reading the papers this weekend who will be very worried about Nigel Farage's progress. And I say to them, come and help the only party that stood up to them. Google join the Liberal Democrats and help us take them on. And I think Labour and Conservatives made a mistake with reform. They've tried to ape them. The Conservatives have copying reform policies, Labour sounding more and more like reform. I think the way you defeat Nigel Farage is by calling him out.
Here's the thing, Trevor, I want to ask you about. We've seen in Canada a reaction to Trump politics with the election of Mark Carney. Depending on who you talk to, similar in Australia. Maybe not, more local issues in Australia, but certainly with Albanese winning yesterday, some are seeing that as a reaction to Trumpism. Do you think Ed Davey's onto something here by being anti-Trump and therefore anti-populism, anti-Farage?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But actually, the evidence suggests not, because, as you say, Mark Carney benefited from the electorate's reaction to Trump in Canada, ditto Albanese in Australia. Come here, Nigel Farage is known globally as one of Donald Trump's best mates. He warmed up for him at his rallies. Literally, our electorate, as far as we know, has gone in exactly the opposite direction from opinion polls and from last Thursday's vote. I don't think, actually, that as far as we can see, Britons don't particularly like Trump, but they don't associate reform with him. I think, by the way, that Ed Davey's got a slightly bigger problem, which he didn't quite deal with in the interview I did with him. If you take a county council like Worcestershire, where Reform won 27 out of 57 seats, in order to run that county, you've got to have 29. Well, the Liberal Democrats have a significant number of seats there, and they have to make a choice. If they want to keep Reform out of power in that council, they are going to have to form a coalition with all the other parties, including the Conservatives. And I put to Ed Davey, what are you going to do? And I thought, to be honest, he didn't really have an answer.
Yes.
At some point, they're going to have to make a choice.
And this is my final question. Do you think, as Nigel Farage and Reform say, it's the end of two-party politics? We're in a sort of five-party political setup now.
Well, I think this is a minority view. I think most people who do politics for a living think that it's probably just a spasm, a bit like the SDP in the 1980s. If I had to bet on it, I would say not. I think that the combined vote for Labour and Tories has been in decline for a long time. And what's happened this week isn't just a sudden thing. It's actually just the first demonstration that actually not just that the electorate has fallen out of love with Labour and Tories, but that the tribes on which Labour and Tory parties were based have been fragmented. You don't have big trade unions anymore. Suburbs are not quite what they were. The middle classes operate differently. So I think we may be in transition, though I can't tell you, Matt, what I think we're in transition to.
Well, it's the end of an era elsewhere, Trevor, because I don't know if you saw, but Warren Buffett is stepping back from running Berkshire Hathaway. I mention this because he's known as the sage of Omaha, but he's 94. Given you're significantly younger, it means we've got the sage on Sundays for quite a bit longer yet. Pleased to have it.
I love the fact that you said it. I'm significantly younger. I like that. I'll take that.
He's old enough to be your dad, Trevor, and my great-grandfather, obviously. Good to see you. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.